If you have a comment that you would like to make that is more suited to actually speaking, then you can raise your hand. That's done using the reactions button in the bottom tab. And so if you look in your bottom tab on the far right-hand side, there's a little smiley emoji with reactions. If you click on that, there's a way to raise your hand. If you do have a comment that you would like to make via voice, then click on that raised hand, and we will select you by letting you know that you're free to talk, and then please unmute yourself and speak. Otherwise, if everyone could please keep yourself on mute, that will reduce the disruptions to everyone else. Thank you. Next slide, please. I'll now introduce Anthony Starr, the Director of the Illinois Power Agency, who will provide an introduction on process and background.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Next slide, please. So as Kevin said, I'm Anthony Starr. I'm the Director of the Illinois Power Agency. With me today from the IPA is Brian Granahan, our Chief Legal Counsel, and Kelly Turner, our Deputy Legal Counsel. From Incline, our Program Administrator, Kevin Quilliam, their CEO, and Alex Rain, their COO, will also be helping out with the presentation this morning. Next slide, please. So I assume that if you've made your way to this workshop today, that you're familiar with the Illinois RPS at some level, and in particular, the significant legislative changes that happened this fall with the enactment of Public Act 1020662, more colloquially known as the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, or CEJA. This comprehensive legislation makes lots of changes to Illinois energy policy, and specifically significant changes to the Illinois RPS. It expands the goals and targets of the RPS. It increases the funding and addresses some of the issues that we've had in the past about how funding flows and is reconciled. There's significant expansions of procurements for renewable energy credits from utility scale and wind, solar projects. And then of interest today that there's significant changes and expansions to the adjustable block program, as well as to the Illinois Solar for All program. CEJA also has a focus on labor and equity in the renewable energy industry, including both transparency through data reporting and increased opportunities for participation from individuals and businesses. And as we go through some of the stakeholder feedback this morning, we'll be touching on those issues that are very important and an important shift for the program and for our work on renewable energy more broadly. Next slide. One of the aspects of CEJA is that it calls on us to open blocks of capacity for the adjustable block program within 90 days of the law taking effect. So that is why we're focused on December 14th, which is that day 90 days after the law takes effect, and what happens when blocks open at that time. For context, we also will be updating our long-term renewable resources procurement plan. This is the program that we use to define our programs and procurements and other aspects about how we administer the RPS. And through that plan, which goes through a proceeding at the Illinois Commerce Commission to approve it, we have that sort of be the shape and form that we then fill in the details of our program. So we're in an interesting situation right now in that we're opening new blocks of capacity for the adjustable block program with new provisions flowing from the new law before we have a new long-term plan. So what we're doing right now with the stakeholder feedback processes today is to really focus on what's necessary for the program to reopen. There will be longer-term changes that will be happening through the updating of the long-term plan. The schedule for that at a very high level is that we will be releasing a draft plan for public comment on January 13th. It then will have a comment period. We'll make revisions. It then goes through a proceeding at the Illinois Commerce Commission. That should result in the plan being approved in July of 2022. So these parallel processes today, we're really focusing on what's necessary for this interim period of when the adjustable block program reopens with new provisions, and through the period at which a new plan which will have new guidance for how we administer programs will be available in next summer. I want to highlight that the IPA is offering more general education opportunities. So today there's really a stakeholder feedback workshop where we're asking for feedback and comments and questions from the stakeholders of the adjustable block program. The Power Hour webinar series is an educational series we started with a kickoff last week of a high-level overview of CJA. We have another session coming up tomorrow on the adjustable block program, and then a series of sessions in the month or two to follow. Those will really be more one-way streets where we're trying to provide some education and context and background around the programs. And the link you see on the slide will be, you can use to get information about all of those webinars and register for them. That's also available right off the IPA's homepage. Next slide. So we'll go into more detail on all of this, but at a high level, the structural changes of the adjustable block program, I think, are the main key ones to focus on are the following. First, moving to an annual block structure. Now, this is actually something that does not happen right away. This is not part of our 90-day reopening plan of the program, but this is something long-term we're going to move towards a structure where blocks are annual rather than based upon capacity. We expand the program from 3 categories to 6 categories. In addition to our small DG, large DG, and community solar, we now have specific categories for projects at public schools, what is known as community-driven community solar, and equity-eligible contractor block, which is for a specific subset of contractors who qualify as equity-eligible contractors. And then there's some changes obviously made within these categories, such as the dividing line between small and large DG changing, the maximum size of community solar programs, of distributed generation projects will increase to 5 megawatts, etc. We still will have administratively set REC prices, but there are now new requirements around equity and prevailing wages. There's going to be changes to the length and terms of contracts that we'll be talking about at the afternoon workshop. And our consumer protection provisions are going to now be included in our long-term plan in more detail than we've had previously. Next slide, please. Oh, can we go back one slide? Sorry, one more slide. Thank you. So a lot still stays the same from the point of view if you're an approved vendor or designee or a general program participant. The basic structure of the program is unchanged. We still have approved vendors. We still will have designees. The concept that a disclosure form is the starting point of a distributed generation project or a community solar subscription remains the same. Our consumer protections remain the same. You will submit, if you're an approved vendor, a Part 1 application that will be reviewed and approved, and then a Part 2 application when the project is completed to verify that it's energized. We will still have the concept that projects are included on batches or product orders as part of a master rec contract, and contracts and subsequent product orders go through an approval process at the Illinois Commerce Commission. We still have the concept of front-loaded rec payments out there that will change for traditional community solar and public schools projects. But so a lot of the program stays the same, but what we're going to focus on today are key things where there are changes to the program that will be required for the opening of it again, and where we have either sort of proposals that we want to put forth to you, or are specifically open areas where stakeholder feedback would be valuable. Next slide, please. So in terms of reopening, the Law Act sets out a set of megawatt capacity for blocks and prices that are listed here. In the interest of time, I won't go through each of these. You can refer back to these later. But again, we have certain megawatt capacity for each category and a set pricing structure. One exception to that is for large DG, where for projects that are not on wait lists, we are going to be updating the prices, and that will be one of the items that we'll be talking about this afternoon. Next slide. So as Kevin had mentioned, our workshop structure is that we have these 7 items that we are asking for stakeholder feedback on that we will be going through one at a time. For each of these, we'll sort of frame the issue for the topic and the issue for consideration, and then ask some of the key questions. So I want to note we issued written requests for comments. We're not going to list every single question we had from those in the slides today in the interest of time, but really the key ones. But obviously, if you reviewed those and you have specific feedback on questions that we don't particularly raise during the workshop, feel free to bring those up as well. We also will hopefully, if time goes as planned, have time at the end for more general comments that are not contained in the written requests. So if there's other topic areas people would want to raise. A reminder that this afternoon, we're going to have an additional workshop that will be focused on the updated rec delivery contracts that starts at 1 o'clock Central Time. It has a separate registration link that should be available in the announcements of this workshop. And to circle back to what Kevin had mentioned in the opening of this, what we are asking people to do is if you could submit questions through the chat, we will try to review those and answer the applicable ones. And then if you do have a question that's more complicated, we may ask if you would like to unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand if you specifically would like to speak. We have allocated times for each of the stakeholder feedback topics, so we're going to try to very hard to sort of keep to those time frames. So there may be certain cases where we have questions that have still come in, but we need to move on to the next section. If there's time at the end, we can probably circle back to those or follow up after that. Next slide. In terms of written feedback, which is really very helpful, we are interested in your feedback today, but ultimately written comments are the things that are very useful for us as we really sort of sit down and work through the final details of how we will open blocks. Those are mostly due November 4th. The community-driven community solar request for feedback we issued slightly later. That feedback on that is due on November 9th. Of course, if you can submit comments early, we have a lot of things that we need to do between now and December 14th. So early submittals, as always, would be appreciated. Next slide. With this, I will turn it over to Brian Granahan to discuss prevailing wages.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. This is Brian Granahan, and I'm the Chief Legal Counsel of the IPA. And as Anthony noted in his introduction, we have, I believe, 6 or 7 different topics to work through today, one of which is our process for confirming that prevailing wage was paid on projects where prevailing wage requirements apply. Just to reiterate a few things from the open, workshops like these are certainly very helpful. It's very good to take the temperature of different stakeholders and get some sense of what parties are thinking. However, written comments are often the most valuable to us because they're static, they're fixed, we can refer back to them. So I would say, even if you make comments today through your presentation, don't hesitate to reiterate those items through written comments as well, as that will ultimately prove very helpful to the agency as we work through how to handle these issues for block reopening. Another point that Anthony raised too is just for scope purposes, understanding that this is just what we're planning for block reopening. Many of these issues will be handled in more detail as we develop our next long-term renewable resource procurement plan. And we're planning additional workshops and comment processes before we even draft that plan. And then obviously after we draft that plan, there's a comment process associated with it. So in terms of the longer term for the program, we'll have other processes where we can kind of talk through how these things should be handled. But for block reopening, that which is required within 90 days of the law, according to Public Act 102-0662, this comment process exists to help us make sure that we've worked through some thorny issues before we can then reopen blocks on what I believe is December 14th. So with all that in mind, as we go to the next slide, one of the primary changes found in Public Act 102-0662 are enhanced waiver requirements applicable to projects participating in the adjustable block program or in the agency's competitive procurements. For those competitive procurements, which aren't really in the scope of today's discussion, there's additional requirements related to project waiver agreements. Now, for the adjustable block program, we have prevailing wage requirements. And there are a couple of exceptions to those prevailing wage requirements that we'll get into as one of the topics here. So, for instance, prevailing wage does not apply to houses of worship, does not apply to projects classified as residential, and there's an express exception regarding large distributed generation project wait lists from prevailing wage found in 1-75C1G4 of the IPA Act. The changes are mostly contained in section 175C1Q, And C1Q1 specifically offers language regarding prevailing wage. Each facility shall be subject to prevailing wage requirements included in the Prevailing Wage Act. The agency shall require verification that all construction performed on the facility by the renewable energy contract delivery contract holder, its contractors, or its subcontractors. So we're drawing a circle around all the construction activities associated with the project and not just the approved vendor itself. Relating to construction of the facility is performed by construction employees receiving an amount for that work equal to or greater than the general prevailing wage, as that term is defined in the Prevailing Wage Act. So that's the new legal requirement, and that applies upon block reopening to a set of different categories, but with the exemption for waitlisted large distributed generation projects. Now, in preparation for employing this new requirement for block reopening, we've outlined a proposed approach, and that proposed approach is found in the documents that we released last week, through which we seek documentation and verification that the prevailing wage requirement was met. Just to walk through that approach really quickly. So during the Part 1 application process, should the information provided by the approved vendor indicate that that project type is subject to Prevailing Wage Act requirements, then the approved vendor would be required to acknowledge that requirement, that the individuals engaged in the project construction will be paid prevailing wage. Now, Part 1, the construction in most cases we're assuming has not itself yet been completed. So that's why what's being affirmed there is just an affirmation that prevailing wage will be paid. Then for Part 2, when the project is being verified as energized, the approved vendor must certify through an attestation that the project has met the applicable requirements of the Prevailing Wage Act for the whole construction of the facility. Now, how does that get demonstrated beyond just an attestation? What we have proposed for purposes of employing this requirement for block reopening is that the approved vendor must provide a copy of each certified transcript of payroll for the duration of facility construction for all involved contractors. The program administrator would then review those certified transcripts of payroll to verify that prevailing wage requirements have been met for the project. So that's the process that we've outlined in the documents that we released last week in order to apply prevailing wage requirements at the outset of the opening of blocks within 90 days of the effective date of the act. So as we go to the next slide, there's a set of questions, and for the balance of these presentations, generally, someone from the IPA will be providing background and scope on a specific requirement, and then we'll hand it back over to Incline for Incline to then walk through some of the specific questions for stakeholder feedback. Answers may come from the IPA, may come from Incline. It may be cases where we just want to make note of something based on the question that's asked. But that's how we're going to operate for purposes of today's workshop. So as we go to the next slide.
All right, thank you, Brian. Good morning, everybody. This is Alex Ryan with Incline. As Brian noted, we will be going through reviewing the stakeholder feedback questions for each of the topics on the webinar session this morning, starting with this one on prevailing wage. These questions fall into two different subheadings, one in documentation and one on verification. Under documentation, is the certified transcript of payroll, or CTP, the appropriate documentation to request as proof that prevailing wage was paid? If not, what forms of documentation should be provided to verify that prevailing wage was indeed paid? And for facilities that were completed before submittal of Part 1 of the APP project application and which did not pay prevailing wages for the project, should prevailing wages be paid retroactively and be documented through a CTP? If not documented by a CTP, how should the program administrator verify that prevailing wage was paid retroactively for already completed facilities? Moving on to the verification subheading, how can the program administrator confirm that prevailing wages were paid on 100% of the project construction and not only for the CTPs that were submitted? What would be a reasonable benchmark hours of construction labor per kilowatt of installed capacity to use? And how would those vary by project size and type? How should the program administrator verify that workers were properly classified in the CTPs? Are there any other best practices for CTP verification that the program administrator should use for verification of prevailing wage requirements? The law requires that it shall also be mandatory upon the contractor to whom the contract is awarded to insert into each subcontract and into the project specifications for each subcontract a written stipulation to the effect that not less than the prevailing rate of wages shall be paid to all laborers, workers, and mechanics performing work under the contract. Should all contractors using subcontractors provide a copy of their contracts for the program administrator to verify this language for all of a project's subcontracts in place? Or would an attestation that this requirement has been made be acceptable, with the provision that the program administrator could request further documentation for verification as needed? With that, we will review the questions coming in through chat and address any questions that everyone has.
Thank you, Alex. Kevin Quilliam again here. There are a couple of questions that came up that are not applicable to prevailing wage, but are more general questions. We will hold those until the end of the presentation so that we can stay focused on each particular item that we're covering as we're covering it. The first question that's come in on prevailing wage was, can you elaborate on the benchmark statement? And I'll send that to Brian.
I'm sorry, what was the benchmark statement? I apologize, I wasn't familiar.
This is Anthony. I can actually handle this one. The benchmark statement was one of the questions we asked is basically it was the concept of benchmarking in this context would be sort of assessing whether the hours reported on a project are reasonable for the project size. So I'll just make up some numbers for simplicity here. So if you'd expect that a 100 kilowatt system is going to require 100 hours of work as a typical size, the question is then if we get certification that shows only 50 hours of work were submitted, then that obviously raises questions. So one of the things I think we were looking for here is, based upon the types of work that are subject to prevailing wage, industry feedback on the typical hours for different size projects would be very helpful.
Thank you, Anthony. The next question is there clarification on exactly what type of project will require prevailing wage? And they can unmute if there's additional questions on it. And I'll hand that to Brian.
Yeah, exactly what type of project? I'm a little bit confused by that phrasing. There's clarification in the law regarding different categories of projects in the adjustable block program and when there be an exemption from prevailing wage. So let's say the default is that prevailing wage does apply, except in such cases where the project is A, residential, B, a house of worship, or C, a waitlisted large distributed generation project, as there's an express exemption for waitlisted large distributed generation projects found in section 1-75C1G4 of the IPA Act, as modified by Public Act 1020662. So the better way to approach things might be, when does prevailing wage not apply, as opposed to thinking through specific categories of projects for which prevailing wage does apply.
So that's my question. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I guess I want a clarification in terms of what David Ronan actually just asked a minute ago, as far as like family farms. Are family farms going to be required to also have prevailing wage? Because technically that's a residence, but they also potentially have an EIN.
So if we go back to some of the introductory slides, we have a second set of kind of a second topic, which is the proposed residential and house of worship classifications. So this is a separate topic that we're handling after this, which is, how do you define a mixed use facility as residential? So for purposes of this discussion, we're talking more about, assuming that prevailing wage does apply, how are we verifying that it was followed, and what does that application process look like?
The next question is regarding family farms, so we'll hold that. The next question is regarding construction of small, below 10 kilowatt commercial projects before completed interconnected in July of this year, before the new rules, but not yet submitted. And would they be grandfathered in? I think, Brian, that would probably be most appropriate to hold until that section as well. Unless you'd like to answer that.
Well, I don't know that that necessarily gets into anything in the next topic, but it is a hole in the law as it's drafted, where on the one hand you have an exception for residential projects and you have an exception for waitlisted large distributed generation projects, but you don't have an exception for waitlisted small distributed generation projects that are non-residential. And some of those projects may well have been constructed, which raises retroactivity concerns regarding the application of prevailing wage. I think we're still in the process of evaluating the right way to handle those projects. As in all cases, the IPA's approach and the approach that we talk about consistently with the program administrator is making sure that customers have positive experiences through the program. And we're going to try to view any, whether it's grandfathering, whether it's retroactivity, similar considerations governed by that principle. But we do recognize that there's a bit of a gap, it seems, where a small DG project that is non-residential is not, if it was just built a little bit larger and was on a wait list, would actually have an exception apply to it that the small DG does not apply to the small DG category.
And just to clarify that what Brian's referring to are projects that are on the wait list, that meaning they have been submitted to the program. And this question was a project that is not on the wait list, meaning that it was just simply by nature of its interconnection date. And so I believe that that has not been considered as something that would be grandfathered. So if you wanted to put comments in on that, you would want to specifically address that. The next question is, are there requirements beyond just wages, but also benefits that are related to union labor, i.e. education funds, vacation fund, et cetera? I'll let Ryan answer that as well.
Yeah, I'm not certain. We can do some legal research, and if there's additional clarification that's required on our end regarding the application of the Prevailing Wage Act, we're not experts inherently in labor issues and labor standards. So if there's additional information that's required from firms and understanding how to comply with the Prevailing Wage Act, then I think I would submit that in written questions, and we can take it under consideration and figure out what additional clarity we need to provide.
The next question is, can you clarify what is considered residential? There are some gray areas such as multifamily and family farms. I think we addressed that a little bit. And we would certainly appreciate clarification that that commenters could make on what they would consider residential or not residential under the confines of the law. And Brian, if you have any more comments on that, I'll let you add those.
I think that's the next topic in the workshop. Okay. So
the next question is, why is there a prevailing wage requirement for public schools but not houses of worship? If Brian wants to add to that, he can, but I would say that we're following the law, and the law requires that.
Yeah, qualitative determinations as between project categories that are found in the law are not decisions that the Illinois Power Agency made. Those are decisions that came out of negotiations that occurred over a 2.5-year time period. We can't speak authoritatively as to why things landed in one place or another. I would say that if you're a solar project developer, I would follow up with your trade associations who are more directly involved in those negotiations as to why things came out as they did. But we have to apply the law as it's been drafted. That's our job as an implementing agency.
The next question is, how much is the prevailing wage, and does the amount change per scope of work, electric work, construction, et cetera?
My understanding is that the Illinois Department of Labor publishes prevailing wage rates for different categories and I believe different geographies of the state.
Thank you. The next question is, how will certified payroll be submitted? Will we be required to use the illinois.gov certified payroll portal? There are not plans at this time to use that portal to submit payroll. However, that certainly could be an option in the future. And any comments that the stakeholders can provide to us on what would minimize the workload for submitting this information and reviewing it would certainly be appreciated. There's one more question I think we've already covered, which is what's covered beyond wages, insurance, pensions, training, and vacation funds. And as Brian said, the agency will look at that. Looks like that's the end of our questions for this section, so we can go ahead and move on to the next section.
Yeah, one thing I just want to add real quick is, any of those questions can be put in the written comments. We've deadline of November 4th. I think that'll be very helpful to us because it helps us understand then what we need to address expressly as we prepare for block reopening in mid-December. So the more of those things that you can put into your written comments, I think the better off we'll be.
If you can advance to the next slide, we will move on to the next section. Residential and house of worship classification. I'll hand it over to Brian. If we can advance to the next slide.
Yeah, I'm still on the stakeholder feedback questions, so Kevin.
Sorry about that, Brian. We'll try and get that fixed. If you want to just go ahead and get started on residential and house of worship, we'll work on the slide advancement for you.
Sure, and I think this is something that has come up a little bit already in some of the questions that are received, which is good because it lets us know this is an area where there's some potential confusion, and we have some draft proposals. But I think based on some of the questions, it sounds like there's maybe more specificity that we should offer regarding certain mixed use property types. So as discussed briefly in talking about the new prevailing wage requirements, two of the exceptions from prevailing wage concern residential properties and houses of worship. So the Act expressly states that projects that are not classified as residential or houses of worship are not exempt from prevailing wage requirements, but those that are residential or houses of worship are. And we felt like we need some further refinement of these classifications and the ability to verify whether properties actually fall under these classifications as part of the project application process to ensure that if they are exempt from prevailing wage, we have the right affirmation or the right level of proof to demonstrate that they in fact would be. So for purposes of the residential classification, now currently we have kind of like a self-designation of, or the way that the program is operated to date, self-designation about a residential class of properties. It's not necessarily all that consequential with the project application process, but we're looking to change that now that there's a different benefit that applies to being classified as residential. So we're looking to classify a residential project as a solar project that is located on a property where electrical usage at the premises is predominantly for residential household purposes. And for mixed use buildings or sites, for that site to be considered residential, more than 75% of the site's electric use must be used for residential purposes. And again, the purpose here is to say that if you're going to be exempt from prevailing wage, then for purposes of that property, more than 75% of the electricity's usage must be used for residential purposes. This is our draft proposal on this front. So if thinking about family farms, you would be looking at the balance of electric usage that the system is ultimately offsetting, being 75%. And that's our proposal here, and we'd love to get some feedback on this. The second point is on the house of worship classification. New section 1-75 C1Q1 defines a house of worship as a property that is both used, one, exclusively for by a religious society or body of persons as a place for religious exercise, religious worship, and two, recognized as exempt from taxation pursuant to section 15-40 of the property tax code. We're trying to figure out a good way to figure out how we can verify that those actually do apply. For purposes of the tax exemption, we're looking at something like a property tax form or something else that demonstrates an exemption from the property tax code. But we're very interested in feedback on this front. And then some sort of attestation regarding the use for a religious purpose is what we're looking for a house of worship. But we would love to get feedback on this. Again, the qualitative decisions made by the General Assembly regarding the exemption for houses of worship, maybe not for other facilities, that's not something under our control. What we would like right now is some feedback, and we have some stakeholder questions that Incline will run through on these specific points. So we go to the next slide.
All right, thank you, Brian. Apologies for the technical glitch there. We are back up and running on slide 16. So look at the stakeholder feedback questions for this particular topic. There's two subheadings, residential and houses of worship. So under residential, is 75% of a site's electrical usage for residential purposes the appropriate standard for considering a mixed-use property as residential? What should be considered acceptable documentation to verify a residential classification? And under houses of worship, for houses of worship, are there specific considerations that should be included in the affidavit that the facility is used exclusively for religious exercise or religious worship? And with that, we can start taking questions from the chat.
Thank you. A few questions came in late about prevailing wage. We'll add those in at the end. Staying on with house of worship now. The first question is, under house of worship, would private schools on the same property as the house of worship have to be prevailing wage?
So I think at this point, that's an open question that we'd love feedback on through comments. The law on the one hand says exclusively. On the other hand, it's very difficult to read that as literally as it may seem, because properties are rarely used exclusively for any given purpose. So to think that because there's a private school on the property, that it's not being used exclusively for religious practice seems like a challenging way to apply an exemption, given that many churches also have corresponding schools associated with them. So I think it's something that we have to consider, and we're very interested in feedback. If anyone has any experience in other jurisdictions applying a standard like this, I don't know that it exists in other jurisdictions, but if it does, that would be helpful to us. It's just one of these calls that we're going to have to make.
Thank you. The next question is, would a corporate-owned multifamily be considered residential if 75% of the property is apartments?
Our proposal was to base it on electric usage rather than square footage or something like that. So I think, again, that is our proposal. We're seeking feedback on it in terms of a best way to define what is a residential property.
Thank you, Anthony. The next question is actually, what if 75% of electrical usage on residential changes after installation, which is somewhat related to that?
I think as it stands right now under our proposal, we're looking at mixed use facilities as of the time of installation. And I don't know that we'd necessarily have the means to be able to measure what happens thereafter. But Anthony, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that. That's something that's probably poses a challenge, but one that I don't know that we have the tools to be able to solve.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, for items like this, at some point you have to pick a moment in time in which you're determining whether something is qualified or does not qualify for it. So I would view this as part of the project application. But again, if someone has a suggestion for another way to monitor this and what would be a reasonable time for it to be maintained, certainly would be interested in that as well.
I think it's good to have the context. We're talking about an exemption from a wage paid through waiver requirement and not the eligibility of a system writ large. So it's not that projects that change their usage status or projects that might be in a similar boat can't participate in the program. There's a point at which, if you're looking to participate and you may fall under prevailing wage, it's probably in your best interest to follow the Prevailing Wage Act, ensure those employees are being paid prevailing wage, and then there's no ambiguity associated.
While we're on 75%, we'll go to the next one, which is, does the exemption apply to community solar serving at least 75% residential and or house of worship?
No, this is not. This would not apply in that way. That's not a residential project. If it's a community solar project, it's a greenfield project. It's not directly offsetting that customer's use. The subscriber share. Hopefully that's off. The subscriber share, which is something that can change over time, is not what we're looking at in making a determination about whether a project would qualify for this prevailing wage exemption.
Thank you. The next question is, at this point, is the 25 kilowatt threshold for prevailing wage set in stone?
I'm sorry, Kevin, I didn't hear the last part of what you said.
Is the 25 kilowatt threshold for prevailing wage set in stone?
The 25 kilowatt threshold for prevailing wage. I'm not sure that I follow the 25 kilowatt threshold for prevailing wage. There's prevailing wage applies across the board unless the system is a waitlisted large distributed generation project or a residential project or a house of worship. The 25 kilowatt threshold ultimately concerns whether a project is a small DG project or a large DG project. So I guess I'm not sure how, for prevailing wage purposes, that unless this is a question about waitlisted project status specifically, I'm not sure that I follow how that applies.
Okay, if it's Norm Johnson is the person asking the question. Norm, if you'd like to unmute and clarify, you can feel free to do that. If not, we'll move on. I'll give you a couple seconds to do that. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Would a residential bill be considered acceptable documentation? The documentation for residential versus commercial, we would certainly be interested in hearing stakeholders' feedback on what would be acceptable documentation, both from a perspective of ease of use of the customers providing the information and integrity of the program and the system. So I would certainly encourage that. Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
I think anything regarding acceptable documentation is something where we're operating a little bit blind at the outset, at least. So if parties are providing written comments and believe that there's ways to demonstrate, say, a mixed-use facility has usage of a certain type, or the facility qualifies as residential, or the facility qualifies as a house of worship, those sorts of items are really valuable to us. Hello?
Yeah.
Those sorts of items are very valuable to us in written comments.
To circle back to the previous question about the 25 kW threshold, I'm not sure if this is what the questioner was asking, but in our proposals for requests for feedback, we had suggested that the projects larger than 25 kW AC in size that want to be classified as residential would be required to provide documentation rather than an attestation. So if that was the question, again, that was a proposal we considered in terms of where would be a good break point in terms of level of documentation required. If that seems like it's too high or too low, again, that'd be something that written comments with an explanation for why a different proposed breakpoint would make sense.
Yeah, that's something where I think we felt like there has to be some point in which the burden shifts and there has to be a demonstration that the project is residential. That's just the point that we chose. It follows the small DG, large DG breakpoint in the law, but it doesn't speak to whether prevailing wage applies to projects above or below 25 kilowatts in size.
Thank you. There's two more questions that go back to the prevailing wage question from before. We'll hold those until the end and cover them then. Are there any more questions before we move on to the next topic area? Okay, we'll move on to the next topic area then, which is equity eligible contractors. This will be covered by Anthony Starr.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned in my introduction, one of the changes to the adjustable block program resulting from CJA is the creation of a new project category for projects from applicants that are equity eligible contractors. Specifically, what the law defines an equity eligible contractor as is the business that is majority owned by an eligible person, or a nonprofit or cooperative that is majority owned by eligible persons, or is a natural person that is an eligible person offering personal services as an independent contractor. So to unwind that a bit, the Act also then defines what an equity eligible person is, and there's a number of categories there of someone who is a graduate from a variety of job training programs, someone who is a graduate or currently enrolled in the foster care system, someone who is formerly incarcerated, or someone whose primary residence is in what's known as an equity investment eligible community. And an equity investment eligible community is either what's known as an R3 area. This is a geography that was created, I believe, as part of the cannabis legalization in Illinois for equity determinations in that program. And then they could also be an environmental justice community as defined in through the IPA's long-term plan. We use environmental justice communities in the Illinois Solar for All program for reserving a portion of the funding of that program for projects that are located in what is known as environmental justice communities. So there's two geographies that can be considered. There's a fairly substantial overlap between the two of them, but it's not exactly the same. And one of the things that we'll be working on is maps that show those communities and their overlaps. What we're seeking feedback on this time is how to, the approach to the requirements related to how do we certify a contractor as an equity eligible contractor, and then also the Act gives us provisions about how do we allocate capacity within this category that we'll go through. One thing I want to note here is that the Act has provisions in it related to equity eligible contractors being able to receive advances on rec payments. Typically in the adjustable block program, payments for recs are not made until after a project is energized. The General Assembly in developing this category recognized some of the financial challenges equity eligible contractors may have, and to seek to overcome those, put in a provision to allow for the advance of rec payments. That has to be developed through our long-term plan, so that will be part of separate process to develop that and will be implemented upon approval of that plan. So that is not a feature of the equity eligible contractor category that is applicable at this time for the initial opening. Next slide. So in terms of our proposed approach, what we're suggesting is that we will do the equity eligible contractor certification at the approved vendor level, and that it will be a supplemental application to our existing approved vendor application. So either new approved vendor would have that as an option as they fill it out. Existing approved vendors could go back and fill out that supplemental application, and it will basically go through the three requirements, the requirement listed here, that whether you're a business, nonprofit, individual, will obviously need information about ownership structure, or board composition in the case of a nonprofit, and then information about each of the individuals. We also are proposing that the 75 megawatts of nameplate capacity for this block, that we would allocate 70% of that to projects in Group A, which is generally the ComEd area and the rural co-ops and municipal utilities in the PJM part of Illinois, and 30% to, I'm sorry, this slide has it backwards. It should be the other way around. 30% is in Group A, 70% is in Group B. We will get that corrected. I believe that's a typo that may have been in our comments as well. But again, that generally follows the structure of allocation that we've had throughout the program. At this time, we're not suggesting any specific allocations between distributed generation projects and community solar projects that an equity eligible contractor could submit. Next slide.
All right, thank you, Anthony. All right, the questions that we're looking for specific feedback on related to equity eligible contractors fall under 4 headings: registration process, duration of certification, EEC marketing, and block sizes and group allocation. So under registration process, should any information submitted through the EEC application process be designated as confidential? Will an affidavit from the applicant certifying that the information submitted is complete and accurate be sufficient to verify eligibility? What documentation should be required to confirm that individuals are a graduate of or currently enrolled in the foster care system, or to confirm individuals who are formerly incarcerated? Under the heading of duration of certification, how long should EEC certification last? Should it coincide with the AV renewal process, thus requiring re-verification each year? How long does eligibility need to be maintained? Under the heading of EEC marketing, should EECs be provided with a unique program badge that they can use to identify themselves as program approved EECs? Should designees of EECs be provided with a program badge or other unique branding? And lastly, under block sizes and group allocation, is the proposed capacity for the EEC blocks, 70% to Group A and 30% to Group B, respectively, a reasonable allocation? Should the capacity allotted for EECs be further divided across the small DG, large DG, and community solar, or should the allocation only exist at the group level? And now we'll take a look at the questions coming in through the chat.
And
Thank you, Alex.
one quick,
Oh, go ahead, Anthony.
I just want to reiterate is I double checked the request for stakeholder feedback we put out, and we did have the allocations listed this way, and that was an error on our part. We meant that 30% would be allocated to Group A and 70% to Group B, similar to other allocations we've done. So our apologies on that.
Thank you. The first question that's come in on this is, are EECs allowed to construct large DG and community solar projects only?
I don't believe there's any limitation on them proposing small distributed generation projects.
Yeah, this is Brian. I'm not aware of any limitation, and I think it's the way that maybe that's just a matter of phrasing, but the way that it's phrasing its phrase would make it seem like there's some sort of limitation on an entity's ability to do something, when what we're really talking about here is the ability to participate in a dedicated lane and have capacity set aside through that dedicated lane. And there's nothing in the law that I'm aware of that will prohibit projects of that type from being able to be counted through that dedicated lane.
And just to elaborate on that slightly, as Brian was explaining, those are lanes. So you would have to choose a lane between something like a school project or an EEC project. The next question is, will this allocation be applicable to waitlisted projects too?
I'm not positive I follow the question in the sense that the EEC category is a new category. So there is in fact no wait list for it today because it has not yet opened.
I guess
I feel like there might be, the question might be asking something slightly different. So go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, that's Sela. If you would like to come off mute, and I'll let Brian go ahead as well.
Hi, thank you for, I'm sorry, it wasn't very clear. I'm just trying to figure out if you said the approved vendors can go back and certify themselves, the existing approved vendors. And if there were projects that do have EEC qualification, well, they can be qualified with EEC, but they're currently in the existing wait list. I guess what you're saying, they're not going to be a part of this block allocation. They're not going to benefit from this block allocation, the existing wait list, the projects.
I would point out that nothing would preclude you from taking your project off of the wait list and then reapplying it under this lane.
Yeah,
it would be up to you.
What might be at issue here is just the mechanics of how that's done. And I think it's the sort of thing where if there's a specific factual scenario, I think written comments might be quite helpful. The one thing I could see is if a given wait list ultimately reaches a certain capacity, is there a way to then have that project that's part of another wait list to be able to participate in the EEC block? I don't think there'd be any prohibition against that. What may be at issue is just the mechanics of how exactly that's done and some of the timing questions. And it might be helpful to just sort of get a sense through written comments, what scenario you have in mind, because then we can build out mechanics to be able to accommodate that.
Will do. Yeah, we'll provide written comments.
The next question is, will contractors be able to qualify for EEC and also pull from other tranche allocation funds as well? That's from Robbie. I don't know if you want to clarify, Robbie, but I'm assuming that you're asking, could you do some EEC projects and then also perhaps do a school project as well as the same contractor? We can answer that question. I'll let Anthony and Brian answer that. And if you had a different question, let us know.
My initial reaction is if a approved vendor is an EEC vendor, that if they don't have to submit a project into that category if they didn't want to, but a project can only exist within one category. So I think that's the nuance that I would want to make there.
Thank you. The next question is, how does a company become EEC approved? That's a great question that we are seeking your input on. And so the requirements are listed in the law, but how we actually go about verifying those requirements are something that we're seeking feedback from stakeholders on. Mechanically, it will be part of the approval process that we have for in the program that you are already familiar with, but the exact questions that we ask and the documents that we use for verification are something that we are very much seeking stakeholder feedback on. The next question is, if a contractor is not
just to add a little thing, I think, I mean, as we point out in our excuse me, request for comments, that I think there's kind of several levels of this. First is that there are these three types of entities that can become an EEC: a business, a nonprofit, or an individual. Then we need to know either the ownership structure or board composition. And then, because ultimately the ownership flows down to individuals, we will need to know about the individuals that are either the owners of the business or the board if it's a nonprofit, and information on them about which criteria they qualify as. Again, we list those all in the application, in the request for comment, and they flow right from the law. You know, roughly speaking, participation in job training or former foster care participants, living in an equity investment eligible community, et cetera.
And to expand slightly on that, the approved vendor application process is an existing process that we have, and some of those pieces are already there, and the pieces that aren't there are what we're seeking feedback on. So you can certainly go to the Adjustable Block Program website, illinoisabp.com, and take a look at that approved vendor application and let us know what you would add for the EEC questions that we would ask. The next question is, if a contractor is not an EEC, but uses an EEC as a subcontractor for a particular project, would that make the project EEC block qualified?
Our proposal at this time is to limit EEC qualification to approved vendors, although we're interested in feedback on that. And I think that is something that through the long-term plan, we want to look at other ways in which EECs can participate as program participants. But in terms of the initial opening of the EEC block and the complexity of all the items at issue and the complexity of working through the nuances of that, our proposal at this time is to limit it to approved vendors and then potentially expand that over time through consideration of the policy issues in our long-term plan development.
Yeah, the law is written fairly narrowly on this front regarding the applicant for the state administered incentive. If you believe there's a reading of the law that would allow for us to accept something like a subcontractor status for qualification for this category, I would say offer that theory in your written comments. But ultimately, it may be something that has to be brought before the ICC as we consider our long-term plan.
A related question to that is, will AVDs, which I'm assuming is approved vendor designees, be eligible to be EEC approved or only approved vendors?
Sorry, can you slow down? Say that again.
The question is, will approved vendor designees be eligible to be EEC approved, or is it only the approved vendors that can be approved? So similar to the last question, but more specific to designees again, versus AVs.
Our proposal at this time is to limit it to approved vendors and not designees, because I think there's some complexities that come up very quickly there, but we're interested in feedback on that. If someone can articulate something that's consistent with the law and practical for designees, we certainly will take that under consideration. Whether that can be done for block opening or something that's woven into our long-term plan, obviously I can't say right now until we see what is specifically proposed. But again, I mean, conceptually, to me, the important thing here is that the equity eligible contractor category, my understanding, was created to ensure an increase in diversity and wealth building in the solar industry. And so we want to make sure that if there are participants taking part in this category, that it's structured in such a way that the benefits of the category, and particularly when we get to the next phase of it, where there's advances of capital, that those benefits are flowing through to the entities that the General Assembly intended it should when they developed this category as part of the Adjustable Block Program.
Yeah, and along those lines, it seems to be written fairly prescriptively and in a more limited way, specifically to address any risks of gaming or any risks of the direct participants, not those folks being measured, potentially somebody who's behind them. So, we're trying to apply the law as faithfully as we can. If you have ideas about another way to read the law, then I would say put those in the comments.
Thank you. The next question is actually just a comment, but I'll read it for everyone. It's very much worthwhile finding ways for EECs to work with or partner with established developers or owners/operators to enter this highly technical and complex field. Joint solar parties are likely to address this in comments. The next question is, if a vendor that is a business has partial ownership that is EEC eligible, is there a certain percentage ownership that's required to qualify for EEC? And I'm assuming that the question is what percentage of the business has to be owned by an EEC eligible entity in order to be an EEC. If there's a different interpretation, Solar asked this question, then please feel free to elaborate, but I'll pose that to Anthony and Brian.
I would go back to the definition of equity eligible contractor that's in the Act, which is equity eligible contractor means a business that is majority owned by eligible persons or a nonprofit or cooperative that is majority governed by eligible persons or is a natural person. So that would, if I understand the question correctly, I think that's a pretty simple standard that it's majority ownership. But again, if there's a nuance to the question that doesn't capture, please raise your hand and explain the nuance that I may have missed in that response.
Thank you. That looks like the end of the questions there. If there's, we'll give about 10 more seconds for any more questions. Okay, we will move on to the next section then, public schools. Kelly Turner from the IPA will be presenting this section.
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelly Turner. I'm the Deputy Legal Counsel for the IPA. As Kevin mentioned, we're going to move now into the public school projects category, which is a new program category established under the changes from Public Act 1020662. If you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Some basic information here at the outset. As I mentioned, the public schools project category is a new category under CEJA, and it provides the opportunity for incentives for both distributed generation and community solar projects located at public schools. As Anthony mentioned in one of the introductory slides, this category will account for 15% of the ABP program capacity. The provisions of CEJA specifically provide that the first block for the public schools category will be for at least 50 megawatts of total nameplate capacity. So as explained on the slide here, the agency may create subcategories within this category to account for the differences between the project sizes or locations and projects located within environmental justice communities or within organizational units that fall within Tier 1 or Tier 2 shall be given priority. The references to Tier 1 and Tier 2, and as you will see on the next slide, Tiers 3 and 4 are categories that are determined based upon the results of the annual evidence-based funding distribution process for public schools in Illinois. And our proposed approach for the public schools category relies upon those categorizations from the evidence-based funding distribution, as well as the environmental justice community designations that are contained within Chapter 8 of the current long-term plan. So if we can go to the next slide, we will see a chart which explains the agency's proposal for the creation of additional subcategories under the umbrella of the larger public school project category. As you can see, what we're proposing is that 70% of the capacity for the public schools category, or 35 megawatts from the initial opening capacity, will be allocated to schools that are either in the Tier 1 or Tier 2 category, and or public schools that are located within an environmental justice community. The proposal would then allocate the remaining 30%, or 15 megawatts from the initial opening capacity, to projects that are located at Tier 3 or 4 schools, or schools that are not, and schools that are not located in an environmental justice community. within this overall split of 70-30, the agency proposes that we will further break down the allocation by size within these categories. So 25% of the allocation to projects that are less than 250 kilowatts in size, 25% for projects between 250 kilowatts and 1 megawatt, and 50% for projects that are over 1 megawatt. Additionally, and this is part of our proposal, but it's not on the slide, the agency proposes that if these allocations are not filled within 180 days of the category opening, the projects will then be accepted on a first come, first served basis, regardless of funding tier or location relative to an environmental justice community or the project size. With that, I think we've covered what our proposed approach is, so I will turn this back over to the Incline team to walk through the questions for stakeholder feedback.
Thank you, Kelly. All right, there are 4 questions listed on this slide on which we are specifically looking for written feedback. First is the proposed breakdown of 70% of capacity, or 35 megawatts, for schools that are categorized as Tier 1, Tier 2, and schools located within environmental justice communities, and 30% of capacity, or 15 megawatts, for Tier 3 and Tier 4 schools, the appropriate breakdown. Are the prior year's results of the annual evidence-based funding distribution process a timely source to determine Tier 1 or Tier 2 status? Are there other ways to verify that a school qualifies for Tiers 1 and 2 and environmental justice community categories? Are the proposed size categories less than 250 kilowatts, 250 kilowatts to 1 megawatt, and over 1 megawatt appropriate allocations for each category? Should specific allocations be made to groups or to community solar projects prior to refinement of this through the long-term plan update? We can take a look at questions coming in from the chat. You see there's at least one.
Thank you. The first question is, will the SREC rates for public schools reflect the inability of public schools to directly use federal tax credits and accelerated depreciation?
The rec prices for the initial opening of this block are set in the law, so we do not have the ability to modify them at this time. Now, through the long-term plan development, we'll be reconsidering rec prices more generally for the future. That being said, this category is for projects located at public schools, so I don't believe there's anything that would preclude a project that is either financed through a lease or a PPA where another entity would be able to use the various tax credits and accelerated depreciation. So that may be the one way in which this would accommodate that question.
Yeah, and Anthony, maybe worth talking through what we've done in similar circumstances regarding, say, nonprofits and public facility projects and Solar for All program, simply because there may be entities on this call or other stakeholders who aren't as familiar with that approach.
Sure. So this very issue has come up in Solar for All, which is our other incentive program for distributed generation and community solar that focuses on low-income households and communities. And in that program, there is a specific sub-program for nonprofits and public facilities. And we looked at rec pricing in that as we developed that program under the assumption that those entities would not be able to take advantage of various tax options. We subsequently refined that to have 2 different options depending on if a project was financed that way or was not. And in that program, what's different from the adjustable block program is a requirement about what portion of the savings from the project flow through to the customer. So one way we tried to account for that in that program was the idea that if a project was able to take advantage of tax credits through its financing structure, that the savings requirement that would have to flow through to the customer, the school, or or the nonprofit or public facility would have to reflect the fact that that those taxes are being captured.
Thank you. The next question is if is there a prioritization across the project types of tier 1, tier 2, and EJ? I.e., would a tier 1 and tier 2 project be selected prior to selecting environmental justice projects?
Our proposal was to basically put those all into one bucket. We're not experts in school funding formulas. We do know quite a bit about the environmental justice community designations as we develop those as part of our plan, but our excuse me, our initial proposal was really to have a prioritization for those and then everything else. Again, this would be the sort of thing, if there are nuances of what projects fall into those different tiers that we maybe haven't appreciated, written comments on that would be very helpful, and we could think about further refinement of that.
Thank you. The next question is what qualifies as tier 1, 2, 3, and 4? I believe Kelly covered that a bit, but if there's something we can expand on that.
I can expand on that a little bit. So that comes from the evidence-based funding distribution process for public schools in Illinois. And there is an evidence-based funding distribution calculator that is linked in the stakeholder feedback document. This designation comes directly from the statute, and it refers to the statutes that deal with the funding for public schools. So in terms of that prioritization and how that designation works, we don't have any control or authority or input on those designations, but there is a link within the stakeholder feedback document that was posted on the 14th on the ABP website that can give you some more information on those.
Thank you. The next question is, can you share any context behind the suggestion for 70-30 split? Was it simply offered as a starting point?
I think that's a fair characterization of it.
Okay. Is there a defined timeline for opening the initial block of the public school category?
The agency has until 90 days from the effective date of the act, so until December 14th to open blocks. We're planning on opening blocks on that day. In terms of a timeline, I think I mentioned this, but we did suggest that if there is available capacity that's not filled within 180 days of that opening, projects will be accepted on a first come, first served basis. I'm not sure if the question is specifically is there a timeline for this to close? I don't think that that's part of our proposal. I think it's that it would remain open until there's no capacity available.
And Dave, if you'd like to expand on that, feel free.
Yeah, I was just curious of whether or not the public school program would be become open for, if we have a school that could be either potentially added to the wait list now, or could be added to the public school program on December 14th. If that program was going to open, and we can submit applications for that on December 14th or before.
And the answer to that, Dave, is that it would be on December 14th.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll give a few seconds to see if anyone has any more questions. Okay, we have a short break in the schedule now. The time is 10:15 roughly. So we will go until 10:20 on the break, and we'll resume it.
Or perhaps should we circle back to some of the questions on prevailing wage that that were asked earlier? Maybe we can address some of those now and keep to our original break time.
Sure, we can do that. Someone had asked to show the previous slide, so we've adjusted that so you can see that. Let's go to the prevailing wage questions here. One question on prevailing wage is, will the disclosure form show what classification the worker will be in?
I don't think so, because the disclosure form is about information about the system, not the details of who will be doing the installing. So it's information for the customer to understand their system. So I do not see at this point in time that there would be a connection between prevailing wage requirement and what's on a disclosure form.
Okay.
One thing to note on that point is our consumer protection requirements will be put before the commission through our long-term plan. So it's possible that, as we're developing our new long-term plan, we may believe that there's additional changes to the disclosure form, additional changes to other consumer protection requirements, additional changes that might be warranted by other changes in the law that we want to introduce into requirements. So I think what we're doing right now is trying to provide for temporary solutions to get through the block reopenings while taking some of the bigger picture issues of whether maybe the interactive effects between new requirements, holding some of those over for the long-term plan development process.
The next question is, the biggest question initially will be what prevailing wage classification applies to the type of work performed. There is extensive experience in the application of prevailing wage to wind projects to the state's high impact business program, but comparatively little prevailing wage application to solar projects. Will the IPA rely on IDOL's interpretation of the appropriate classification?
That was certainly my expectation as a starting point, because again, we do not have the same experience with prevailing wage that other entities excuse me, do have. But if there's specific things in stakeholder feedback, written comments on this, that would be really helpful for us to help assess where those boundaries are drawn.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to say, is just if you have alternative ideas or there's challenges with that approach that you think may not be obvious, put those into written comments and we can take them under consideration.
The next question is, since U.S. Department of Agriculture REAP grants, REAP recipients have to show a certain percentage of income from a business located on a rural farm, et cetera, does this push them out of the residential exception to prevailing wage?
I think this would still be governed by our 75% mixed usage, but if there's some reason why there's a disconnect created there, and we're not experts in REAP grants either, I'd say put that into written comments and we can take it under consideration. That's an area where, because we don't have inherent expertise, I think it would be helpful for us to receive written comments, understand a little bit better the nature of the question, and then see if there's something that we want to provide that's kind of more descriptive clarification prior to block opening.
Next question is, what if the main contractor pays prevailing wage, but a subcontractor brought on doesn't follow through and pay prevailing wage properly?
Well, I think at that point, prevailing wage, as it's set out in the law, is not followed, and it's the responsibility of the main contractor, or at least the approved vendor, the direct recipient of state administered incentive funds, to make sure that for all construction activities in the project, the prevailing wage is being paid. So that is the way the law is written. It's intended to encompass not just the direct applicants and not just the main contractors, but also subcontractors. And that is the way that we would evaluate compliance with prevailing wage requirement.
The next is just a comment that delivery service type, according to the utility company bill, would be the easiest way to determine the prevailing wage requirements. Assuming that's the delivery service type would be the easiest way to determine residential status.
Yeah, I think we were looking at that, and Anthony, correct me if I'm wrong, it may vary between the utilities as to whether we have kind of a clean break about whether there's a residential, ultimately something's being residential, does meter a residential customer is being assessed as a residential customer of the distribution utility or not. I know that we had some discussions about that internally.
Yeah, that's correct. I think there are a few layers of that. One is the vast majority of residential projects it's very easy to determine they're residential. It's when you get out to the margin that there are some that there's some interesting gray areas. And so there are, if you look in particular, if you look at Ameren's definition of their rate classes, there are some, again, at the margins that are not as clear in terms of certain types of buildings that are people live in, but where the line is between residential and something where someone is staying in another sense gets a little murkier. So that's one issue. The other layer of issue there is that we, for rural cooperatives and municipal utilities, they may not have as complex distribution rate structures that make these sorts of nuances. So again, while 90-something% of the customers in Illinois are served by ComEd, Ameren, or Mid-American, we also do need to recognize that there are customers of rural co-ops and municipal utilities for whom the information that might be available to assess something is going to be a bit different.
And I'll add, if you live in a or familiar with municipal utility or rural cooperative, and you have some feedback for us on what would be appropriate to use for the specific entities that you've worked with, that would be very helpful to us in feedback. The next question is, I think what Norm is asking is, do projects in the small category have to pay prevailing wage? I thought I read small projects do not need to pay prevailing wage. If it's a public entity, it will be required either way.
Residential projects are exempt from the prevailing wage requirement. Many projects within the small distributed generation category, both as it existed previously, probably less so as it will exist going forward, are exempt by virtue of being residential. But if a project is small but non-residential, it is not exempt from prevailing wage.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency sometimes people conflate our small DG and large DG categories as residential versus non-residential. And in reality, that's not correct, because there are small DG projects that are non-residential projects. And as the same ways that there can be large DG projects, that are residential, such as an apartment building.
Yeah, those are contemplated in the prevailing wage exception as well, for multifamily residential. So that's the dividing line. Again, it's not a choice being made by the IPA. It's just the application of 1-75C1Q1 and how it defines what projects would be exempt from prevailing wage.
Thank you. There's a couple of other questions that came in that either came in a bit later or were classified in a different area. So I'll go through those quickly. This is a question on educational facilities. We can still waitlist school projects in hand, correct?
If the question is, could you submit an application today for a school project, it would go into presumably large DG wait list, because again, the school category is not yet open. There's no way to apply today as a school project. I think the open question there, and I think Brian alluded to this in a previous response, is if there's pragmatic considerations around what would happen in terms of how a project that was on a wait list could move into a new category upon block opening. You'd certainly be interested in feedback on that.
Okay, a couple of unrelated questions from the beginning of the presentation. When will the agency discuss its plans for the community solar waitlist?
We are still working through some of the details of that and issues around how looking at it, if affiliates and some of the decisions that will have to come from that. So we expect to have some information on that shortly, including likely some requests for specific stakeholder feedback on some of the decisions about how allocation works.
Yeah, it's a little, I don't want to say deprioritized, because that's not the right way of looking at it. And certainly it's not deprioritized in terms of what we consider to be a real policy priority. But because there's more of a staged process that allows us a little bit more time, and we're drawing from existing project applications from that category, we're trying to get through these things so that we can then put things into a place where 90 days, block reopening, we have these categories kind of set up. And then we'll be dealing with community solar waitlist allocation questions, say in the next few weeks.
related question to that is whether that process will include a workshop similar to this.
That is to be determined. My initial reaction is that the issues that we need to work through may be ones that a written feedback session would, written feedback would be sufficient, but we certainly can give that some additional thought.
There's a process question about whether small DG is 4% lower than the last DG block when on reopening rather than the last large 10 to 25 kilowatt DG block. Those types of questions I think are more, will be covered in tomorrow's presentation by the IPA, which tomorrow's presentation happens to cover the adjustable block program. So any questions on that, I would encourage you to tune into that.
Yeah, to be clear, Kevin, what you're referring to is the Power Hour, and what we're doing through that series is just educational webinars about what's in the law and not necessarily interpretive questions regarding how the law would be applied. So those are intended to be more educational overviews.
And the registration for that is on the Illinois Power Agency's website for those interested in attending that tomorrow. There's a question about whether the PowerPoint will be available on the IPA website, and it will be posted both on the AVP and the IPA website after the workshops. I think I got all the questions that were missed as we switched from topic to topic. If anyone has any question that I didn't cover that you have not had answered yet and you'd like to cover right now, I'll give you a few seconds to enter that. Okay, we'll have a time at the end as well for any additional questions that folks come up with. Anthony, if you're ready for the break, we can go with that starting now, and we'll be back at 10:35.
That sounds good to me.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. We'll now move on to the next section, demographic and geographic data, which will be covered by Kelly Turner.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, can you hear me? I was having some audio issues coming back from the break.
You're loud and clear.
Thank you. Okay, welcome back from the break. We will just go ahead and dive into the proposed process for the collection of demographic and geographic data. If you can flip to the next slide, please. The IPA is required under CJA to collect demographic and geographic data from applicants and program participants for the purpose that is listed here at the top of the slide. Data collection, data analysis, and reporting are critical to ensure that the benefits of the clean energy economy provided to Illinois residents and businesses are equitably distributed across the state. The changes to the IPA Act under CJA require specifically that the agency collect this data for each entity awarded contracts under any agency administered program. So in the case of the adjustable block program, that would include approved vendors as they are awarded REC contracts through the program. These new requirements include the collection of data, as I already mentioned, from applicants and program participants, which in the case of the adjustable block program may expand beyond approved vendors as the holders of the REC contracts, and also include subcontractors. It may include project hosts. It may include customers. So the agency's proposal to implement these new requirements is to include the collection of this information on the approved vendor application. And then on an ongoing basis, we will continue to gather this information through the annual approved vendor renewal process. So if we can flip to the next slide. On this slide, you will see the general information that we will seek to collect on the AV application or through the annual renewal process form. The stakeholder feedback document that was published on October 14th contains the specific questions that will be included on the form. They are more detailed than this, but we just put the general topics on here so that people could see them. The questions will be added to the application and renewal forms as required fields. So the application and renewal forms will not be able to be submitted without answers to these questions provided. The topics, I'll just run through them really quick. Number of full-time and contracted employees, number of employees in or outside of Illinois, whether the organization is minority owned or a female owned business or small business, the gender identity of employees, age, race, ethnicity, and education level of employees, numbers of employees who are formerly incarcerated or are graduates of or currently enrolled in the foster care system, and employees who are veterans, reserves, National Guard members, or disabled. As I mentioned on the stakeholder feedback document, there are more specific information related to these questions, and I encourage all of you to go and look at those and provide written feedback on those. Before we move on to the stakeholder questions that were issued, I also want to note that approved vendors will be required to collect this information from their subcontractors under our proposal, and they would report that information to the program administrator. Additionally, all of the data that is collected will be aggregated and reported annually by the by the IPA via the ABP program website, and we are also planning to include maps of locations of program participants in that data provision to the public. And if we can go ahead and go on to the next slide, I'll turn things back over to Incline for the stakeholder feedback questions.
Great, thank you, Kelly. All right, the stakeholder feedback questions for this topic fall into two subheadings: data collection and reporting and accuracy of data. So under data collection, are there demographic categories or classifications that the proposed list that, as Kelly mentioned, is in the written request for stakeholder feedback fails to capture? Please provide specific examples and reasons for their inclusion. Are there any proposed demographic categories or classifications proposed that should be altered? Please provide specific examples, reasons for proposed changes. Are there any proposed demographic categories or classifications that should be removed? And again, please provide specific examples and reasons. The agency seeks feedback on the process for the submission of data collected by approved vendors from subcontractors. One possible approach would be for approved vendors to submit subcontractor information on a project-by-project basis. Another approach would be for approved vendors to submit subcontractor information on a quarterly basis. The agency is also open to alternative proposals. For each proposal, please provide an explanation as to why a particular approach may or may not be preferable. For purposes of subcontractor reporting, should approved vendors be required to report demographic and geographic data on each subcontractor with whom the approved vendor worked on a project under the program during the reporting period? Should the subcontractors from which this data is collected be limited to those with a direct role in project development, such as sales, marketing, and installation? Are there other categories of subcontractors to be included or excluded, and if so, why? New section 175C20 refers to collecting data on, quote, program participants, unquote. Might this be understood as referring to customers or hosts? If so, how should the IPA seek to obtain demographic information about customers, and what sensitivities apply to making such inquiries of customers? Who is the right entity to collect that information, and how? And how should that information then be reported back to the IPA? Under the subheading of reporting and accuracy of data, for the purposes of determining an approved vendor's geographic location, the approved vendor may be headquartered outside of Illinois or may have more than one branch office. Is the main office of an approved vendor an accurate reflection of that approved vendor's geographic location? Alternatively, should the branch office which runs the approved vendor's ABP participation be used, or is there a better representation of an approved vendor's geographic location? which measures should the agency consider to facilitate the collection of accurate data from approved vendors? And now we'll turn to questions coming in from the chat.
Thank you. The first question is, will this location data be available on a zip code basis by applicant/awardee?
The proposal that we have is to aggregate the data, and like for the project maps that are currently on the ABP website, that location data is based on a zip code basis. I think that's probably what we would do, but if you have any specific feedback on how that data be provided publicly, that's something that we would appreciate receiving in written comments.
Thank you. The next question, the data collected, is it applicable only to people working on ABP programs, or will it be required for all employees, including those working on unrelated projects?
As written, the proposed approach states employees. It does not specifically outline employees or subcontractors who are only working on ABP projects. If there is a way or a suggestion that it should be done that way, again, I would encourage responses to the written request for feedback as to how that approach could be implemented and why it might be a preferable approach to the one that the IPA has outlined.
This next question parses that a little bit more, Kelly, to ask, does this include subcontractors that may do any electrical or roofing work prior to installation actually happening?
I think it would obviously depend on if that's a part of the application. If they are working with the approved vendor on the project, I would imagine that a subcontractor involved in the project overall would be included on this list. If there's a suggestion that certain types of subcontractors or designees should be included and other types of subcontractors or designees should be excluded from the project reporting requirements, that is information that we are definitely interested in receiving feedback on.
The next question is, for clarity, does the IPA expect approved vendors, to collect this information from each of their approved designees and the designees subcontractors? An AV could obviously have many designees with hundreds of employees each and many subcontractors under each designee.
Yeah, I think we recognize that there are many approaches to how this information can be collected and from whom it can be collected. And that is part of what we are seeking feedback on. Right now, I think the way that the proposed approach is written is that we would be the approved vendor would be collecting information from all subcontractors. If that is a subcontractor that is nested under another subcontractor, that would be required to be reported by the AV. If there are proposals or suggestions on how to manage the reporting requirements, or a way that we could manage reporting from another entity beyond the approved vendor, we would look forward to receiving that proposal in written feedback.
Next question is, will this demographic data reporting fall under the annual diversity report that AVs have to submit? I'm assuming this is the annual report that you're referring to. And if there's an expansion on that you'd like to make, you can take yourself off mute and expand on that.
Yeah, hi, this is Theodore. Yes, so this is regarding the annual report that AVs already submit. I was wondering if, this demographic data will fall under separate reporting, or would that be subsumed into the current diversity reporting we have to submit?
My thoughts on that are that that current reporting requirement flows out of the last approved long-term plan. And as we've mentioned several times, we'll be updating that plan for approval by next summer. And these are new requirements under the law. So certainly thinking about where information is best collected will be part of that. And that could potentially, again, not making any commitments at this time, could include rethinking what we've had in the plan already about the reporting that goes on into the annual report.
Okay, there's, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions at this time. We can go ahead and move on to the next subject, which is large DG rec prices. To go ahead.
Great, thank you. Next slide. So the context of what we're talking about here is that we've already brought up several times the fact that that CJUD specifies certain price adjustments for a block opening, and then we will be obviously revisiting rec pricing through the updated long-term plan. But for the large distributed generation category, there's a specific provision that for the price of renewable energy credits for any projects that are not on the wait list, that they'll be determined and published by the agency. In other words, rather than having the 4 or 10% decline from last open block, that we have some flexibility in defining those prices. These are also the projects that, generally speaking, other than the exceptions we discussed earlier, prevailing wage will now apply for. So what we are proposing is a process where we are doing a limited update to the rec prices to account for the incremental cost of prevailing wage. So this will be an interim solution for looking at large DG rec pricing, with a longer term solution being included in our next long-term plan. Next slide, please. So the approach we've taken for this is that we decided to go back to our original rec pricing model that determined the rec prices that are currently in effect. And we sort of said, well, what if we go back to that, look at the labor cost assumptions that were embedded in that, adjust those to account for prevailing wages, calculate the rec prices, and then roll forward to the current, where we would be for the next open block. And the way we did this is that we looked at a study that had been done last year looking at the impact of prevailing wages on solar costs in Illinois. And that study had a range of impacts of prevailing wage requirements that range between 23 and 41%. So for this thought exercise, we took the starting point of that range and then applied it to the labor line item in our original rec pricing model, and then moved it forward. So what that looks like is what you see in the table here, where generally speaking, it's a roughly $2 to $3 increase in rec prices to account for prevailing wages. Next slide. The way we got to this is that if you go deep into the weeds of the rec pricing model from the initial long-term plan, we have an appendix that lists out cost data we had gotten from an NREL study on solar costs, and that's what we used in the initial rec price modeling. And there was a line item for labor costs. The way the rec pricing model we developed works is that we had 5 different size projects. We modeled the cost of those, and then used those to sort of create different bins of prices that were used for the ultimate categories or size categories for the adjustable block program. So the numbers listed here are specifically what was in that model is what you see in the left side columns. These are the installation labor costs that were assumed, both expressed in dollars per watt DC, as well as what that would ramp up to for each of those size projects in terms of installation costs. Then again, applying to that cost, the 32% upward adjustment shows you the numbers that are on the right. The reason I want to break these out is because in terms of thinking about this model and this approach, one thing that would be very helpful from stakeholders would be to look at these labor cost assumptions and give us a reality check of do these seem right, and does this proposed adjustment for prevailing wage feel in line with what installers understand would be the cost of compliance with prevailing wage. So again, specific feedback on these prices would be helpful. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Anthony. So to review the questions on which we're looking for specific feedback from you all, are the agency's proposed installation cost estimates appropriate? And if not, what adjustments should be made? Should the adjustment in price vary by system size? And should different adjustments be considered for Group A and Group B rather than a single statewide adjustment? And now we'll turn to the chat.
Hey, we have one question that's a little bit unrelated, but since we don't have any others, I'll address it quickly, which is how many kilowatts are in each wait list at the moment. That information is available on the illinoisavp.com website. If you go to that website, the program documents tab, and then scroll down to the block capacity dashboard, that information lives there.
One thing I would note on those numbers, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, is that at this point, the projects that are in the 10 to 25 kW range, that when they are still classified as large distributed generation, they have not been reclassified into small distributed generation.
That is correct. And so that means that the large DG wait lists are showing a larger number than they will be when that reclassification happens. And obviously the small DG wait lists will gain additional capacity. The next question is back to the topic at hand, I believe, which is what about sub further divisions such as Chicago area versus the rest of ComEd territory, and asking about the division of adjustments between A and B.
Again, that's the sort of thing that I think, specific written feedback on proposed, divisions like that, I think we would be interested in. That could get complicated in the sense that right now we have just Group A and Group B and set prices for each of those. This would, if we were to start dividing our groups up into further subgroups, that would get very complicated. It might be the sort of thing that would require approval through our long-term plan rather than a change we can make midstream right now.
Yeah, just on this point, Anthony, there's kind of a constant tension between specificity and elegance, transparency, and clarity on the other hand. And so I think we're always trying to grapple with that. And with the way that we've broken down project sizes and prices applicable to it, the way that we've broken down groups is how we balance those things to date. But certainly as we move into the new long-term plan development process, if parties feel like because the market's maybe at a more mature point or because most entities have had more time participating in the Illinois market, there's maybe a different rebalancing. I think we're interested in arguments along those lines.
I would add from the implementer perspective that if there's any additional information you can add on how you would actually make those determinations of where those lines were drawn, and then how you as applicants would prove to the administrator that you fell on one side of that line or the other, would be very helpful from the point of determining whether the suggestion is the difficulty of implementing the suggestion. So you could add that detail if you have it, that would be helpful. The next question is, there are several supply chain forces that have created upward pressure on turnkey installation costs. Examples are steel, freight, and labor. At the very least, these have eliminated the implicit 4% cost curve reduction built into the old plan. Do you see the opportunity to address this with the upcoming price?
The updating of rec pricing that will go into the updated long-term plan will absolutely factor those in. That's part of that refresh process. Again, what we're looking at here is a shorter term solution for the immediate problem at hand, which is the blocks that open in December prior to the approval of that long-term plan.
Thank you. The next question, are the large DG project contracts still 15 years, or are the contracts revised to 20-year contracts?
For distributed generation projects, those remain 15-year contracts, with the exception of distributed generation projects in that project that's functionally a distributed generation project, but is in the public school category. All public school projects in that category are 20-year contracts with a different payment structure. The afternoon workshop will be going into much more detail about those payment structures because those become contract issues and will be reflected in the refreshed contracts that we're planning for block opening.
The next question is not directly related, but we'll go ahead and address it anyway. So just for projects that missed the upcoming November 1st deadline, which is when for everyone else on the line, November 1st is when the waitlist applications will be closed to new applicants. Will there be a moratorium on applications until December 14th? And the answer to that is yes, the applications will be paused until December 14th. However, disclosure forms can continue to be submitted and completed during that time period. We'll give a couple more seconds to see if there's any more questions. Okay, we'll move on to the next topic of community-driven community solar.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. So we've talked a bit about this morning about the new categories within the adjustable block program that have been created. We've talked already about the public school category and the equity eligible contractor category. The third new category is what is known as community-driven community solar. This new category has several aspects to it. And what is contained in the act is the idea that there is a set of criteria related to how to prioritize the selection of community-driven community solar projects that are laid out in great detail in the act. But then there is also a provision that for the initial block opening that we should follow what we had in the currently approved long-term renewable resources procurement plan. So this is something where this is an interim solution to how we select community-driven community solar projects. There will be a more comprehensive consideration of the new criteria that are contained in law that will be worked through as part of the development of our long-term plan. So the approach that we're suggesting, and this builds off what we had in our long-term plan, where we put out a proposal, and then the commission, when they approved our plan, asked us to do additional stakeholder feedback to try to refine aspects of that proposal. We did a stakeholder feedback process in November and December of last year. And then as we developed the long-term plan that we published for comment in August, we also sought additional feedback, and that plan included a refinement of the approach. That plan was subsequently withdrawn by the agency when CEJA took effect, because we now are developing a new plan to comply with the new provisions of the law. But in essence, what we're proposing here for community-driven community solar for this initial opening is the following. One of the things we heard when we first put out our plan was we had the idea that we would announce block openings, we would give 60 days notice and then 60 days for projects to apply before we would do a selection process. We heard very loud and clear that that was too short a period of time. So we're proposing here that when blocks open on December 14th, there will be a 180-day application window. What that means is that projects can submit Part 1 applications anytime during that 180-day period, but we will not do a project selection until that 180 days has passed. We would be evaluating, we would be doing review of applications, but in terms of the scoring for project selection, that will take place after this window has closed. The approach first looks at prioritizing projects based upon the development density of the township in which they are located. We also would then assign points accordingly. We also then would assign a point if a project was issued in response to a site-specific request for proposals. In our initial proposal, we had a requirement that the RFP had to be issued after the block opened. That was, again, something where we got strong feedback on, so we were proposing dropping that requirement. We also would assign a point for projects that commit to serving only what are local subscribers. We had initially proposed a geography of that where it was at the township level. We're now proposing expanding that to the county level, or for the parts of the state where county populations are below 50,000, that adjacent counties would be eligible as well. We understand that while community solar may be an interesting offer to customers, you need a fairly large population base to find enough subscribers for a project. So we wanted to be flexible on the geography in areas where there are just fewer potential customers. We also proposed a point system where smaller projects would be awarded more points. And we would use random selection only as a tiebreaker if projects end up with the same scores. One thing to note on the local subscriber, and I guess we'll get to this in the question, is that I do think we have want some additional thoughts on how size of the project and geographic proximity of local subscribers could be correlated better. Next slide.
All right, thank you, Anthony. So taking a look at the questions on which we're looking for specific stakeholder feedback, and again, the specifics on the points are in the stakeholder document that's posted on the ABP website for your reference. These questions fall under two different headings: project diversity and local subscribers. So under the heading of project diversity, do the point allocations properly weight considerations intended to, quote, increase the diversity of areas hosting community solar projects, the business models of projects, and the size of projects, unquote? How should the agency define community group for the selection process? Should the agency use the definition of community-based organization used for the Illinois Solar for All program? This reference is in section 8.6.2 of the current long-term plan, or should a different standard be used? The purpose of the points awarded to projects developed in response to a site-specific RFP is to demonstrate community engagement and involvement. Are there other ways that community engagement and involvement could be demonstrated beyond a site-specific RFP? How could such engagement and involvement be verified? Under the heading of local subscribers, how long over the life of a community solar project should the local subscriber requirement be maintained? How should local subscriber turnover be handled? Should smaller community solar projects, for example, those below 100 kilowatts or 500 kilowatts, have a smaller area allowed for local subscribers? And if so, what would be recommendations on an appropriate geography? In the now withdrawn draft second revised plan, the agency had proposed awarding 1 point for projects that do not take agricultural land out of production. Should this be included as a selection criterion, and why or why not? And with that, we can take a look at the questions coming in through the chat.
First question is a bit more of a comment, but 180 days is probably not enough to run a site-specific RFP, much less get through the other aspects, because interconnection and permits are project-specific, which is then developer-specific.
We're certainly open to other timeline proposals. Although I would say keep in mind that the next long-term plan, again, would be due to be approved in July, and that would cover the opening of subsequent blocks with a different selection criteria. So while we obviously want to provide enough time to make this work, at some point we get to a point where we may have overlapping approaches, and I think we do need to think about how do we move through this initial block and plan for the future. So I think that would be just one thing that is a little bit of a attention in terms of that timing. But certainly, if feedback on the amount of time needed for this block would certainly be appreciated.
The next question is from Mark. What about the possibility of agrivoltaic implementation? Anthony, let me know if you'd like Mark to expand on the agrivoltaic part.
I will confess to not knowing what agrivoltaic means. So if Mark could clarify that, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Agrivoltaic is the concept of integrating some form of agricultural use, whether it's pollinators or different kinds of crops, or even things like animal husbandry on a photovoltaic installation. This is becoming very prevalent around the country, so it doesn't necessarily take agricultural production off of the site. this changes it.
This is Brian. I think we want to be clear about the scope of this workshop, which is what we're doing to prepare for the opening within 90 days of the various blocks of the adjustable block program as outlined by law. The consideration of different attributes that are not part of what we have to do for block reopening is something that would be more appropriate for our next long-term plan. And the questions become, when and how within the categories now specified for law could you have, say, whether it's an adder, whether it's a carve out or whatever it might be within that block, and tie that back to the statute. But that's something for future workshops. Right now, we're just trying to get blocks open in a manner consistent with what's in the law. For purposes of the community-driven community solar block, we don't really have the latitude to take into account other considerations beyond these items that are pretty much set forth in the law, referring back to our last long-term plan. So we're kind of boxed in terms of the approach outside of just working within that approach where we have some ambiguity there.
Okay, I don't see any other questions at the moment. We'll give everybody a couple more minutes on that, and then we'll be moving into a summary. So if there's any questions that we have not addressed, perhaps that were asked and I missed them, or questions that have come up since the sections where they were covered that you still have, feel free to go ahead and enter those into the chat box now as well. And I'll give about 30 seconds for folks to do that.
I also, during this time, want to just remind people that this webinar is being recorded, and the slides and recording will be posted to the ABP and IPA website. So you have an opportunity to go back and look at these things. If there's stuff discussed that triggers ideas, the written comment deadlines are generally November 4th, except for community-driven community solar, where the deadline is November 9th. So there's still plenty of time to reflect on ideas and provide written comments to us for our consideration.
Okay, I don't see any additional questions here. I'll hand it over to Anthony for a wrap up and summary.
Great, thank you. Well, I'd like to thank my co-presenters today and everyone for attending. I hope this has been helpful and spurs some thought on comments that you'll be able to submit to us. And a reminder that this afternoon, starting at 1 o'clock Central Time, will be the workshop specifically focusing on the new draft rec contracts.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance, and we will hopefully see you all at the afternoon workshops.